All right, Jeff, everyone's in.
Michelle, thank you. Michelle, hi, thank you very much. And for hosting us. Michelle is our managing editor with American Purpose. I'm Jeff Gedmin with American Purpose. Welcome to all of you. Thanks to Jonathan Katz and the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Jonathan is with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Among other things, he leads the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. And it's my pleasure to co-chair that group with Norm Eisen, one of our VIP guests and conversation partners. And over to Norm and our other guests in just a moment. I just want to say at the outset, what a week. So we are previewing with three of the finest people imaginable, the Democracy Summit, the Summit of Democracies this week, convened by the Biden administration virtually. It is at a time, good heavens, 100 things we could talk about, but at a time when Ukraine feels very much under threat, new threat, renewed threat, exceptional threat. And of course, China and Taiwan ongoing remains a topic of very important discussion. I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention, if I have it right, that today is, I think I'm right, today is Pearl Harbor Day, 1941, the attack of Imperial Japan on Pearl Harbor. And I must note the loss yesterday of Fred Hyatt, the longtime editorial page editor of the Washington Post, a friend, ally and friend of virtually everybody on this Zoom call. And it's a tremendously sad moment to hear about Fred's death, but also among those champions of democracy and rule of law, and who's done so much on so many fronts. So please keep Fred, remember Fred, and keep his family in your thoughts and prayers. I wanted to say that. So we have today Fiona Hill, who needs no introduction, but deserves a 30-minute introduction, formerly of the NSC, of Brookings, and who has this splendid book out called Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunities of the 21st Century. It's a wonderful book and storytelling and memoir. We've reviewed it with American Purpose, a review by Gabe Schoenfeld, but if you haven't read it, I commend it to you. And welcome, Fiona, and congratulations on your new book. We have Tom Ilves with us, former president of Estonia. Read Tom anywhere, anytime. Last week with David Kramer in Politico. Later today, or maybe tomorrow, in The Economist. Tom did an interview for American Purpose not so long ago. Michelle, would be good to put that in chat. And then concluding my scene set and introduction, Norm Eisen, who is a friend, a dear friend and colleague, co-chair of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, former US ambassador to the Czech Republic, and 11 other things. But when it comes to true blue, genuine believer, intellect, diplomat, statesman, and advocate, Norm is it. Norm, I want to give you the floor to help scene set. I would appreciate it greatly if you'd say a word about the ongoing work you're doing at Brookings and the Democracy Playbook. You can explain that. And then, if I may take the liberty, start us off substantively and tell us, too, a little bit about the summit, what you view as reasonable expectations, and let's say opportunities, but maybe pitfalls. But thank you all. Tom and Fiona, thank you. And Norm, thanks, and over to you.
Thank you, Brother Jeff. It's been a few weeks since my last American Purpose appearance for your celebration, your first annual celebration. So it's very nice to be back as a fan, friend, and follower. I don't think I qualify in this company as a VIP. I'm simply an IP at best, or maybe we need to designate Fiona and Tom as VVIPs. When I served as a diplomat for the United States, I always made the point when it comes to America's role, our purpose, if you will, perhaps our most important global purpose of advancing the democratic ideas captured as the world's oldest operating democracy, captured in the Constitution and the other documentation of our constitutional republic. We led from not behind. I'm not particularly fond of that phrase, leading from behind, but we led from a side-by-side posture, that we were walking the path of democracy with our allies, and it has ups and downs. I never imagined, of course, the downs that we would confront. Fiona, I tweeted this morning that it was, and I'm told we've maxed out on attendance, so perhaps I contributed my bit to this, that it was an impeachment reunion. You and I saw the impeachment process from two different sides of the table. I never imagined, when I was serving as a diplomat in the prior administration, that we would see the kinds of assaults on democracy that culminated in the refusal, for the first time since 1860, I guess you could argue 1876, certainly the first time in well over a century, refusal to have a peaceful transition of power and to accept electoral results. So we find ourselves, as President Biden honors his campaign promise to have a summit of the world's democracies to talk about the state of democracy and make concrete commitments, and then meet again a year from this December. The summit will take place on Thursday and Friday. We find ourselves in a place where America really has to lead, but very humbly, arm in arm, side by side with our democratic partners. That's what we do, Jeff, you and I, as the bipartisan co-chairs of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, almost 200 individuals from every part of the political spectrum co-sponsoring today, over 70 think tanks and other universities and institutions represented. The idea that the values of democracy are critical national security issue in the Transatlantic Alliance. And that's what the Democracy Playbook does. It is 100 pages plus of the best of the concrete measurable commitments that nations, civil society, and all stakeholders in democracy should make, anchored in the social science evidence. The link is in the chat. Michelle will hammer it. And that's what we're going to talk about today: how to stop backsliding democracies in the United States and around the world, and how to push democracy forward. Democracy in the United States and everywhere has seldom been more threatened, but there have seldom been more opportunities for advancement. And who better than Dr. Hill and President Ilves, who've seen this issue inside and outside of government, and from both sides of the pond, the threats, but also the opportunities. And the two of them are veterans of driving democracy forward. So thank you for having me and us, Jeff.
Hey, Norm, thank you, and a pleasure and a great start. So we're going to have a conversation, these three distinguished colleagues, before we open it up to questions from the gallery, to many distinguished colleagues, and good heavens, deep experience and expertise with us today. But I'm going to start with you, Fiona, if I may. Take us any which way you like, but the way I want to start is, could you look at the summit upcoming and tell us what you view are opportunities, but also problems and challenges, and you might even wish to consider the guest list. Poland is in, Hungary and Turkey is out. I think the Philippines are in, Taiwan is in. I welcome that, but it's not without its complication. How do you sort operationally this week, but strategically overall, the interplay or counterpoint between our devotion to democracy and rule of law and human rights and, let's say, geostrategic imperatives?
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone. And I would just like to commend you on, first of all, having this discussion. And I also look forward very much to learning from it. There's a great group of people in here. I'm kind of seeing all the boxes with everyone's name coming up at the same time, and talk about having a concentration of people who've been thinking about this in so many ways. Look, I think, one of the dilemmas that we face with this democracy summit that I think has been aired on many times before, it's not just the sort of like that larger geopolitical context of trying to define, which countries fall into the democratic category, and, how we then, sort of define this and use it as a mobilization force geopolitically. But it's also, as you were laying out, and as Norm was laying out, the issue of revitalizing our own democracy and the power of our example. Because, one of the reasons that the United States has been the leader in this field has been because we've always put our own democracy at the forefront. And, have, so many entities that kind of straddle the domestic and foreign policy divide here. But as all of us have witnessed over the last several years, and Norm alluded to, are on different sides of this issue, American democracy is in enormous trouble. And it's not just kind of structural aspects of this, the checks and balances in our system, the congressional oversight that we saw played out in the first impeachment trial. We've had a second impeachment trial. How do we get to grips with events like January 6th, for example, which is all kind of playing out there? But is how do we make our systems more responsive to the people who are, now living in the United States, a time of massive demographic and other economic and social change in the United States and elsewhere. And one of the things that I really hope that the Democracy Summit will tackle is that issues about how the world's leading democracies, those that have been defined as such, irrespective of how we then pass out the other countries, can show again the power of their example for revitalization internally. So I do think that there's kind of an element within the Summit of Democracy that I hope that we kind of see of how those democracies that found themselves in trouble, that those who have been the leading lights and the democratic firmament before can share best practice about how to put things back on track again. I mean, this is obviously something that Biden has been trying to do in a very concrete, literally bricks and mortar fashion of the delivery of the system with the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, and the expectation that, kind of having some results from democratic practice on Congressional Hill with passing of bills and legislation that makes a material difference in people's lives will have some kind of reflection on people's stakes in our democracy. But, I think part of our problem is how do we transform people into stakeholders within democratic settings? How do we kind of make the whole system more responsive? How do people see themselves reflected in democracy? And that was kind of really has been at the root of everything here. And I know that we have many people have been thinking about this. I mean, I'd be very curious to hear from Toomas, about, how we've managed to put that into practice somewhere like Estonia, which is a much smaller polity, much smaller kind of country, smaller population, but has also been, pushed over the last 30 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, to figure out how to make all Estonian stakeholders, no matter, their background, the debates that happened in the 1990s about how to incorporate Russian speakers, who'd obviously been foisted upon Estonia during the Cold War period and transform them into stakeholders. Estonia making that transition to the European Union. Estonia now being a magnet for all kinds of people from around Europe to come there because of the vibrance of, Estonian society. I think you've done a great job in showing how people can participate and be stakeholders. How can we learn from Estonia? And then just, very quickly, one of the issues that we're dealing with now in terms of, and this is our issue about autocracies and authoritarian states, the other side of that ledger, there's less ideological basis for this right now. I mean, basically, this is cliques of guys, of strongmen, would-be strongmen leaders, trying to keep themselves and the people around them in power. David and, many others have been writing about this. there's less of an ideological base for this. I mean, in China, perhaps more so than in other places. But when you look at Hungary, some of the problems we're seeing in Poland, the problems we're having here in the United States has been about cliques of people around individuals who want to keep themselves in power, and less about an ideological basis for authoritarianism. This is more about autocrats and kleptocrats than it is about anything else. And how do we counteract that? And how do we push back against that in our own society? So I would like it to be, a bit more of an internal discussion as well about best practice and how we move forward, rather than just focusing on, perhaps the descriptive or, kind of categorization effort of when is a democracy not a democracy.
So Fiona, thank you. And that provides an elegant segue for us to turn to you, Tom Ilves. And if you could address, in my mind right now, two things. One, Fiona's call for self-awareness and the internal reform and repair and rejuvenation that our democracies and that US democracy requires right now, with also, on the other hand, the need, I would say, Tom, for American leadership, because we have new crises looming, and Ukraine is in the news, and the European Union, NATO, and the United States must work together. But, there's this rude, to modern ears, this rude, but I think poignant expression from Bismarck: every alliance has its horse and rider. Still today, however consensual and collaborative we are, the United States has a role to play. We're in a tough spot, we're in a pickle, but we have a role to play. So Tom, rejuvenation of democracies in the US, elsewhere, internally, and also facing frontline states, facing authoritarianism, and even a new crisis at hand. Over to you, Tom.
Well, that's quite a menu. Well, let me say, first of all, I've come to the conclusion many years ago already, but basically there are certain root and branch reforms that the United States will never do. I've become convinced that that until Donald Trump, the only presidential system that did not eventually descend into a lack of democracy was the United States, because basically it's too appealing to be an executive. To be an executive with that much power. And in fact, if you look at the transformation of the post-communist world, but other countries as well, even before the 1990s, there were studies that showed that parliamentary systems simply remain democratic far better than presidential systems. And really the one exception was the United States, until we saw the abuse of power. And the other thing, another root and branch reform, which I fear is perhaps even more dangerous, or rather a problem that is more dangerous, are first past the post single mandate electoral districts, because that leads to a winner take all mentality that we see today in the UK and in the United States and in Hungary, where you all have first past the post elections that basically winner take all. And then to that, we have seen the disappearance really of the idea that you also take into account the opinions of the opposition. And if you look at the US Congress today, there is none of that at all. But those things are probably not possible. Where I think that there are a number of things that can be done actually came out yesterday in the State Department report on corruption, because I think corruption is the one issue that faces all countries, and that makes the authoritarians much more powerful for a number of reasons. First of all, the authoritarians need rule of law states to send their money to, because authoritarian societies are one where you can't trust that you will keep your money. In the case of Russia, that's always been like that, because you didn't even own the property, as Richard Pipes has pointed out since. But especially today, if you go around just blithely taking over the property of Khodorkovsky or anyone else, then you know full well that if there's the right cabal, they'll do it to you. So you end up shipping all your money to rule of law societies. which is also a security guarantee, I would say parenthetically, is that you don't want to invade the place where you have the money. So in a sense, we're stronger in terms of security for that. But be that as it may, the corruption is the real issue. Ideologically, we do have a competitor in China which claims greater efficiency through their democracy. Now, when they say we're more of a democracy, which they have recently, and I've seen some of the things they've written, I mean, it's really all defining sort of participation in a kind of a pseudo-electoral process, whereas for me, democracy is primarily about rule of law, guarantees of rights, equality. I mean, basically, really, I think what we call democracy actually is the republic, which is where everyone is equal, rights are guaranteed, and those rights are the same. We see the United States today actually backing off from that when we look at attempts to restrict voting rights, for example. I mean, you look at that and you go, well, that's not a democracy. And of course, it's been a long way to get to where the West is today in terms of rights. Yeah, I mean, until the 1830s, I guess, or the 1860s, part of the population of the US was 3/5 of a citizen. And while they were given formally the right to vote in 1869, I guess, recalling my high school history, but it wasn't until 1921 that half of the US population got the right to vote. So, I mean, it took a while, right? So, but it's there now. And, universal suffrage and actually the Voting Rights Act of 1965 took the US very far. Right now, we see kind of backsliding of some of those rights. We see in other countries, we see perhaps in some sense, they're doing better than the United States without restrictions on voting rights, and universal suffrage actually came in for the first time in 1917 in Finland. So there's not that either to boast about. I think that the kleptocracy initiative, or whatever it's called, I mean, is really the primary method that we have. I mean, anonymous beneficial ownership is what allows the consigliere of Semyon Mogilevich, the leading mafioso of Moscow, to have two of his consiglieri buy apartments in Trump Tower. It's what allows the guy who, maybe Fiona knows his name, who pushed through the ban on US adoptions to buy a $3 million condo in Miami. I mean, these are the forms of corruption that we see. It's also, but you have to get other countries involved. When Marine Le Pen gets 9 million euros or $11 million from a Putin associated bank for her presidential campaign in 2017, well, then, we see this repeated over and over again, where Frau Kniesel, the foreign minister of Austria, goes to work for a leading Russian oil company, not Gazprom or Rosneft, or some other one, but, okay. And then you have, Gerhard Schröder, about whom I coined the term Schröderizatia as a term for former officials using all of their political lobbying power to push for Russia, in his case, Russia. But we see the same thing. European parliamentarians getting really great deals from Azerbaijan and coming in and talking about how everything is wonderful. I mean, you can repeat it over and over again. People, in other words, are being bought. And until the West or the liberal democracies get to the point where there is a big cost for allowing yourself to be bought or to sell your political influence, we will be in trouble. And then I go back to the minority leader of the House today, who said, well, there are two people who are getting paid by Vladimir Putin, and one of them is Trump, and the other one is Dana Rohrabacher. You can't have either one. So those are the difficult tasks, I would say.
So that's a pretty good and formidable list. I'd like to turn to you, Norm, for a moment. You were chief ethics lawyer in the White House, and you've thought a lot about this knot that has to be untangled, having to do with ethics and money laundering. And I'm going to add to it reputation laundering and all sorts of problematic lobbying activities. And Norm, also, when I consider the hats that you wear today, you're keenly interested in the state and health of American democracy. Could you pick up on anything you heard from Fiona and Tom and advance the conversation a little bit, please?
Thank you, Jeff. And I want to thank Fiona and Tom as well for those provocative interventions. I think starting with Fiona's points, that the need to, Fiona, I would characterize the analysis of our present woes, particularly when it's not a balanced analysis in the United States or with our democratic allies, of the advantages and opportunities, as the hand-wringing about the state of democracy. I share the assessment of the threats, but I think it's important to also look at the opportunities at home and around the world, to recognize that the American people spoke in a great national referendum on the direction of our country in favor, and quite decidedly, if you look at the popular vote tally, in favor of continuing on the Democratic road with all its ups and downs, and to look, as you urge, as Dr. Hill urges, perhaps this is why she's so vexed, the former president. What are the concrete things that we can do? If she'll forgive me, she's my friend, she's my colleague. The example that she set by speaking out when others were not so bold, both internally and then publicly. What are the concrete things we can do? And Tom talks about this too, and I'm going to come to the anti-corruption and ethics points, including Mr. Picton, who I think is I may be mispronouncing his name, who is the Russian legislator he's pointing to with the Miami condos. I'll come to that, but what are the concrete things that we can do? That's why we wrote, myself and my wonderful and very distinguished, they're also VIPs compared to my IP status, co-authors of the Democracy Playbook 2.0, from individual citizens all the way up to nation states and multilateral organizations. The things, Tom, that we can get serious about is the question whether America will ever step up in these regards. I agree with you. The anti-corruption commitments were important first steps. But the Democracy Playbook, myself, the likes of Alina Polyakova, the head of SIPA, John Katz, who's on with us, the head of the Democracy Initiative at GMF, and so many other wonderful co-authors, Tori Tausig, who was then at the Harvard Kennedy School and now has joined the government. She did this work before she joined the administration. Susan Cork at the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of our most distinguished anti-hate, anti-discrimination groups in the United States. The concrete things that we're going to hold the United States feet to the fire and everyone else, like on this anti-corruption, and we talk a lot about anti-corruption, we need concrete commitments to move forward. And just looking at the people on this screen, so many wonderful colleagues who've held our feet to the fire when they were in and outside of government. We capture all three pillars, reflected the needs that Fiona and Tom reflected, and the three pillars of the Democracy Summit are in the Democracy Playbook. 1, anti-corruption. 2, fighting democratic backsliding. 3, promoting human, civil, and other rights. Those are the areas of emphasis. We have, if 10 commandments were good enough for the Lord to give to the Jewish people and all of us, I suppose, who follow those traditions. We've tried to model 10 commitments. They're really clusters of commitments for every participant in democracy. That's what's in the playbook. And I think it's responsive to what Fiona and Tom have called for. Back to you, Jeff.
Norm, thank you. I'm going to turn back to, thank you, Norm. And I'm going to turn back to you, Fiona, before we open it up to questions for Tom and Norm and Fiona and comments from the gallery. Fiona, feel very free and invited to speak to Norm's question. We need these concrete things to do. And then also, if I may, because it's been alluded to, is it change in our political culture? Why is it, I'll put it this way, you're to be lauded and honored for your tremendous and inspiring integrity. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. And I ask you also, why is it we see such a growing deficit in these things, lack of courage to speak out, for people to say what they know is wrong? We don't live in a country where people disappear in the night. And yet people go along with things that are highly problematic, put charitably. Could you speak to the political culture in our politics today? And then also Norm's question and challenge, we need a robust list of things to do.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with Norm and also Toomas about the way that they've laid this out in terms of the importance of the rule of law and corruption, anti-corruption. This is, of course, in underpinning the republic and in terms of the equality of rights. So, I mean, I just completely agree with everything that's been laid out there. And I do think, as Norm is suggesting, that high standard of ethics, that gets to my point about the power of our example, is something to really hone on to. I also agree with what Thomas says, that China is the country that is really offering a kind of an ideological challenge here, kind of a power of a different example, a different way of delivering, kind of within the system. Of course, there's plenty of kleptocracy and corruption behind the scenes there in China. But other countries that we're kind of grappling with, Russia and elsewhere, there is no real kind of ideological challenge to us, but there is the challenge of corruption. And this gets to the point that Toomas was making about Schroederization. Look, we could have also talked about George Osborne, the former Treasury Minister of the United Kingdom, working for Deripaska. And all of our think tanks and universities that have taken money from oligarchs and others. I mean, I could go on a tirade for ages about this. I mean, I've got a long list of people who is looking at a bunch of them, that I, kind of really am appalled at times about, the fact that they've lost their compass. And why is that? And I think it's because of that breakdown of ideology. And also a different perspective, and this ties into your question, Jeff, about national security considerations. I mean, one of the reasons that I came, out of the administration, decided to write a book and also to speak out, is that, I wanted to make that point that our partisan divisions and our propensity for corruption and, kind of emphasis on individual gain, power, you name it, has become a national security crisis. I think with the end of the Cold War, people have, kind of started to judge the environment in a very different way. I think it was more evident where the threat came from during the Cold War period. The Soviet Union was seen as an enemy, and there was kind of more of a sort of a concentration of the minds as to where the risks came from. Certainly kind of a threshold that people wouldn't step over, or if they did, it would be obviously framed in a very different idea. If Soviets, communists, kind of with all of the kind of the labels and the associations that kind of came with it, were wanting to give you money, kind of buy your property. But when it's Russians without the Communist Party, who are sort of seen to be kind of capitalists, without kind of seeing this as the linkages that they all have into the kind of Kremlin that many of us here, know only too well about, that they're investing in your property, that people are not so well aware of Mogilevich and, kind of his links to organized crime. This is all just sort of seen as, a whole new world in which these people are just simply investors and business people and, their ties are very different. Then, people tend to get dazzled by the influence of all of that money. and they kind of lose their moral compass and the ethics that Norm, spent so much time, trying to instill in his role in government. And, I think for myself, I've never lost track and lost perspective on who these people are and where they came from. I was a national intelligence officer. I know who they are. I know who they're tied to. This was, part of our problem in the previous administration of, the kind of dirty tricks that have steeped into our politics right now, the Political Compromising Act, the political action committees. People like Trump were unable to see the difference between what he was doing and what the Russians were doing, for example. And this kind of goes across the board. Why is it that Senator Lieberman, for example, would think that leaving government and working for a Chinese telecommunication company was a good thing to do, or George Osborne working for Deripaska? Has nobody, been thinking still about this kind of rule of law, anti-corruption, anti-kleptocracy, and if you sit down with people who had former, not just high security clearances, but formerly responsive positions, and thinking about, why they think they're advocating for the companies of adversarial countries that are tied into their governments is a good idea, for example. I think, in terms of people's own political courage and their let's just say the constraints on speaking out, I thought exactly along the lines you did. What are people going to do to me? I'm, still ostensibly in a free society, but, there is this whole world out there on the internet. I have had hundreds of threats made to me. I've had all kinds of efforts to defame me that are made. I just kind of basically, perhaps from my background, my upbringing that I lay out in that book, been there, done that. It comes with the territory. I was expecting this to happen. I'm not afraid to stand up and to speak out. A lot of people are afraid. They're afraid for their position. They're afraid for what people will think about them. They're afraid of those threats. They're kind of, afraid of losing their, kind of position in society, what people will think about them, the names that people will call them. There's a little bit too much fear out there. And the only way that we overcome this is to do the things that many of the people here are already doing, is speak out together. Stand up for what's right together, that kind of moral authority, that ethical principle, and to, set an example. This comes back to the power of example again. I was very well aware when I was asked to testify that I would be setting an example, and I was ready to do that. And I continue to want to speak out and to think that's important to speak out at whatever cost that comes to myself. Of course, I'm worried and concerned about it, but this is one of those moments where, if we don't speak up, we don't try to challenge things, we don't do concrete things as Norman has laid out, and I've done the same thing in the back of my book, concrete things that people can do, then we will lose everything. That is, kind of one of those clarifying moments, and all of us, in our own lives will have to stand up at some point. Well, I would say this point is now. So let's all stand up and do it together, because there's certainly a lot more solidarity and safety in numbers than when people stick their necks out alone. And I mean, that's the message that Tom learned, as kind of being part of the Baltic states in exile, and, the effort to kind of mobilize in favor of Baltic independence and then sovereignty and independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. That's, kind of, we have to apply those same things now.
Fiona, thank you. Those are clarifying and compelling remarks. And I think we'll return to some, if not all of that, in the 20 minutes remaining, or north of 15 minutes. I'd like to open, Gesundheit, Tom Ilves. I'd like to open the gallery right now. If you have a question, use the raised hand function, wave at me. If I miss you, Michelle will note that, or put your question in chat. Anybody there currently ready to ask a question? I think I have, Michelle, who do we have? I can't see it right now.
Donald Emmerson, could you kindly ask, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
And identify yourself, please, each person who speaks.
Yeah, my name is Don Emmerson. I run the Southeast Asia program at Stanford University. I'm not an expert on democracy, but I really appreciated the conversation so far. I could not agree more with Fiona that, I quote here, China is offering an ideological challenge. It was commonplace and sort of normal among China-wallas to hear the argument that China is ideologically promiscuous, right? They'll work with anyone, right? So the idea was to reinforce the image that this is just a power grab by individuals at the top who want to be president for life. Fiona is right. I may not be the only person among us who spent much of the morning watching a different dialogue, not with the 50 squares that we have on the screen, only 12. And the purpose of that dialogue, which went on for a long time, sponsored by CGTN, unsurprisingly, was essentially to convey an alternative definition of democracy, which we are free either to ignore and concentrate on, more specific matters of individual behavior, or we are free also to try to fashion, yes, an ideological response to that challenge. The Chinese sometimes refer to real democracy, quote unquote. They sometimes refer to whole process democracy. I won't go into all the details of their argument, but the question for us is this: are we prepared to defend liberal democracy without any reconsideration of elements of that liberal democracy that may have been part of the problem of its decline? Is there such a thing as semi-liberal, not illiberal, but semi-liberal democracy? Don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to radically alter the terms of our conversation, but I am suggesting one point, and I'll leave it with this. Is it possible to jettison extreme libertarianism in our understanding of democracy? Would that be constructive?
So Donald, thank you. I'm going to refer all three colleagues, Norm and Fiona, are welcome to respond, but I'd like to turn that first to you, Tom, if you'd like, and pick a piece. There are a number of parts there, but pick a spot and please weigh in.
Well, as I briefly said earlier, this emphasis on decision-making through various forms of participation as superior to the plebiscitary forms of democracy that they are opposing really has nothing to do with what we talk about when we talk about democracy. I mean, the point is, you could have, all the people you can have discussions on anything you want. That's great. That's not the democracy part. The democracy part is when you cannot mention Tiananmen Square, when you slowly sort of just smother Hong Kong, where you cannot talk about what Mao Zedong did to 40 million people, or you can't talk about Uyghurs. I mean, that is really you can't make informed decisions. And instead, this is being portrayed, to my mind, at least, as, oh, this is a way we get over the vitocracy problem described by Frank Fukuyama, where you have too much NIMBYism and you can't build a railroad from San Francisco to wherever. I mean, you can't build a light rail system in California. That's not what we're talking about. Of course, an authoritarian system is more effective in getting stuff done, because if you disagree, either you aren't heard, or if you disagree too much, you aren't there anymore.
Thank you. Fiona and Norm, would you two like to weigh in on this question or cluster of issues raised?
Only to say that scholars and practitioners of democracy, and I'm it certainly makes me more of a dilettante than either President Ilves or Dr. Hill, but I'm both a scholar and a practitioner, and in terms of continuing to litigate democracy issues, for example, in my bipartisan role at the States United Democracy Center with our former GOP governor, Christy Todd Whitman, my co-chair, and I dabble domestically and internationally. So across those four boxes, in every part of that democracy matrix, if you will, thought and action, domestic and international, you have to grapple very profoundly, but in different ways, with the competition of China. In some ways, because it's so vexing in the transatlantic relationship, the presence of Russia, of course, the Russian bear is there right outside Tom's study, virtually breathing, panting heavily. I can almost see the windows fogging from Putin's overexcitement, most lately at being engaged and recognized by the United States in this engagement with Biden today about Ukraine. Not that I'm against the engagement. China is by far the by far the greater strategic threat. They take advantage of the Russian distraction to lull us. Jeff, it deserves a session, a seminar, and a full-blown project of its own. I'll only say one last thing before passing the baton. Among the many lessons, positive and negative, that we must learn from the Chinese are the aspects in which democracy needs to, because of the constraints that we have, for example, in dealing with the Chinese effort to corner the critical cobalt market. Again, corruption issues come into play here. This has been in the press lately. And the slow moving nature of our lack of industrial policy in the US. We need to be more nimble, more well coordinated, and also ask ourselves, how do we broadcast the message? And I know this is a concern of the Democracy Summit, and it certainly is an obsession of our democracy playbook. Democracy delivers. That ours is a system that delivers better. This is not some, just a philosophical problem, although it is one, and we need the philosophical insights and guidance. It's a practical problem of how we persuade to our American constituency and our global constituency. How do we persuade them that democracy is actually the best system for delivering the things that they want the most? So China is important in those aspects and thousands of others.
Norm, thank you. You all, here's what I'd like to do. There's so much and so many, but we have a hard stop in 10 minutes. Let me call on David Kramer, and then as time allows, Gary Schmidt and Ion, but we'll see what we can do. And David, you first, and Fiona will have the first word in the round in reply to your question or comment, David.
Well, Jeff, thanks. But you know what, if you don't mind, let me yield to Ion to give him an opportunity to ask. And if there's time, I'll come back. I think it would be nice to hear from him if that's okay with you.
Well, that's lovely and gracious. And Ion, you have the floor, and please identify yourself. Tell us who you are.
Thank you. I also have a hard stop in 10 minutes. I have a class to get to, but my name is Ayan Wuladina. I am 13 years old. I'm joining here in Austin, Texas. So I was just in another session about how young people are the ones who are going to protect our democracy in the future because young people know what's right. And I learned that no matter where young people are on the political spectrum, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, young people come together to get stuff done. And that's the great thing about them. And we need to have more young people get out and vote, lobby their officials, and run for office. How important do you think it is to engage the youth? And how can people like myself, teenagers, get more involved? Because I know teens are longing to make a difference, and I want to be a voice for those people. And if I may, just one side note question. What do you think of the two-party system? Right now it's getting pretty divisive, and I feel like young people also understand that the two-party system may not be working.
So gosh, Ion, are you taking a course in 10 minutes or are you teaching a course in 10 minutes? That was pretty good. Seriously, thank you. Fiona, you want to go first, please?
Yeah, look, I'm just delighted that Ian spoke out because, in my book and just in general, I'm advocating mentoring up. Ian, we need you. We need you to mentor up to us because we need cross-generational coalitions to get things done. As you said, teenagers, younger people need to have things done, not just want to have things done. This is your future that we're talking about here. And, people of my generation and above who are kind of messing things up, getting things on the right track. We need some of this energy and the fresh ideas of revitalization. I am not a fan of the two-party system either. I've never found my place in it. I find, the definitional and ideological squabbles of it confounding because it's not focused on getting things done. The bipartisan spirit has disappeared. And I think we need the mobilization of people like yourself in the grassroots, working with others who have found themselves in position of authority and power, like people who are here on this, Zoom call, to kind of work to basically push people to do things in Congress. I mean, if we want to take this idea of algorithms from Facebook that are pushing us all into contention, our political algorithms are doing the same. that emphasis now is on who shouts the loudest, who has the most kind of performative, entertaining approach. I mean, I was with some of my extended family over Thanksgiving. People are a bit older than you, but not much. And I was asking some of them why they'd voted for Donald Trump, because they're all kind of 18, 19. They said because he was more entertaining than the old boring guys. So, you know, this is kind of problematic in itself, because we're not feeling the vitality of the political system. People are not relating to it, as you're suggesting here. And there are other ways of getting things done, as Norm, you know, is laying out in the blueprint, as you know, Toomas and others, and you know, I know David would be speaking to this as well. So look, I mean, there are different ways of getting involved here. You're already doing it by being here. I think, you know, kind of engaging in your student groups, you know, at school, not just Model UN, but how can you kind of like basically plug in to kind of public service? Entities, you know, of universities like institutes of politics should be reaching out to students at school like yourself and bringing them in. You can be the Greta Thunberg of, you know, politics to push for action. I mean, she's really getting attention and mobilizing people. But the other thing is to mentor up, like I said, and to work into cross-generational coalitions, cross-racial coalitions. How do we get everybody involved in working together? I would work with you in a heartbeat. You know, so let's kind of like figure out, you know, how we can all take ourselves on the road to get people mobilized to step up in defense of our democracy and with new ideas. And, you know, often at these summits, we do try to have, you know, think tanks and other groups involved, but we don't, you know, often find the direct pathways of continuing that work afterwards. So if you have ideas, you know, have at it, and let's try to see if we can actualize some of this stuff. But thank you so much. And I hope, you know, that, you know, we're not holding you up from, you know, your next class, but we need you already. And it's, you know, kind of, you know, too late by the time you get to be 18 and in college, you know, for this. So let's figure out something now.
So I'm going to call on Tom. I will get you in, David. Ion, if you're late in the unlikely event, you get a note from Dr. Hill, Ambassador Eisen, and President Ilves. That's not too
Might not
shabby.
help.
Tom, please.
It's not always a democracy.
Just don't show that note to any of my teachers, Zion, because they'll say he was late for every one of our classes too, and tear it up.
Okay, you all. Tom, please.
2 points. One is, I think, one of the worst thing that worst crimes perpetrated by American journalists in the 1960s was the division of generations, and now we have these pointless discussions on you know, boomers, Gen X, Gen Z. I mean, this is pointless. I mean, these things, you don't run politics based on age, and that's just. And then on the technical side, the two-party system comes out of a first past the post electoral system that comes from single mandate electoral districts, and you can read all about that. And there's even such a thing called Duverger's law, which says that when you have single mandate elections, you end up with two parties. And that's something you could even look into because it's kind of interesting. And I think that's one of the problems that we face today.
So Tom, thank you. Apologies to Gary Schmidt. Gary, I'm not going to get to your question, but read Gary's question in chat, please. And read Gary last week in American Purpose, a piece called The Primary Problem on How to Reform Our Primary System. David Kramer, you have the word before we wrap up.
Thanks, and Ian, I'm glad you went. So you've renewed my hope and confidence in things. Just very quickly, my question is about enabling. And it's a specific one about a recent piece that the National Interest published by the Russian and Chinese ambassador. And I don't mean to put you and Michelle on the spot, Jeff, but I'd be curious, would you have run such a piece? It seemed that the National Interest gave its fact checkers the day off when that piece was published. But I'd just be curious, your thinking, and if others have a thought on whether they have a right to write it, but you don't necessarily have an obligation to publish it. So I'd be curious in your thoughts on that. Thanks.
So David, my short, inelegant answer is I believe in pluralism and open debate, and I believe in open minds. But as they say, not so open that your brains fall out. We would not publish that. I would not publish that. Okay, so here we are at 1:58, 2 minutes before the hour. I would like to first mention, if I may, to keep following our work this week in relationship to the Summit of Democracies. Tomorrow we publish a piece co-authored by Dan Twining and Richard Fontaine. Tomorrow at 12 noon, we have Carla Robbins in conversation with Tom Main of the Brookings Institution on his new book on the rise of illiberalism. But for purposes now, big enormous thanks to Tom Ilves and Norm Eisen and Fiona Hill, three distinguished public intellectuals, policy practitioners, and if I may add, and you don't need me to tell you this, true blue and genuine fighters. I want to offer you, Norm, as our co-host today, the final word. And as Norm closes us out, if you're inclined, please switch on your cameras so that everybody can greet and say goodbye to everybody in this last minute. Norm, over to you. Wrap us up, please.
Well, what a marvelous hour, and the wonderful colloquy at the end with David and Fiona and Ion was one of the highlights for me. The youth is part of the reason that I'm optimistic about the future of democracy. I would publish a fact-check version. It was ill fact-checked, Jeff, but I would publish a fact-check version, David, of that Russian-Chinese essay together with a rebuttal, probably side by side. I think part of the strength of democracy, part of dealing with the China challenge, the Russia challenge, is to have it out on the level playing field, in the sunlight of transparency. We will win that battle, but we need to construct the playing field. We need to have the battle. We need to make the premises express, and we need to be robust in our defense, not, as Fiona said, just the hand-wringing about how bad it is, but the concrete solutions of the anti-corruption kind that Tom pointed to. What a marvelous conclave in defense of democracy. Jeff, Fiona, Tom, David, Ion, and everyone. Gary, for your patience in not being able to ask your very good question that is in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you to
Good
everyone.
afternoon, good evening.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.